Good evening. Welcome to the Maison Française. Sorry for my frog in my throat. It's a great privilege for us tonight to welcome Benedicte Savoy to talk about thinking about absence in museums. Benedicte Savoy is a professor of modern art history at the Technische Universität Berlin, and from 2016 to 2021, she was also a professor at the Collège de France for the cultural history of artistic heritage in Europe from the 18th to the 20th century. Her research focuses primarily on museum history, French-German cultural transfer, Nazi-looted art, and post-colonial provenance research. She was the co-author with Felwine Sarr in 2018 of a report on the restitution of African cultural heritage. The report was commissioned by Emmanuel Macron, which is the first time a French president has recognized a moral right of restitution of African cultural objects from France to their countries and cultures of origin. The aim of the report was to assess the history and present state of publicly owned French collections of African cultural objects originating from illicit or disputed acquisitions, and to make recommendations for the preparation of eventual restitutions, including international cultural cooperation, provenance research, and legal frameworks. Since publication of this report, Benedicte has also been a proponent for the restitution of African cultural heritage in German collections and actively participates in research and public discussions about this issue. Her other publications, recent publications, include Africa's Struggle for Its Art, History of a Postcolonial Defeat, which has been translated in several languages, and the joint publication of Atlas of Absence, Cameroon's Cultural Heritage in Germany. She's also the winner of numerous awards for her research and teaching, including the 2016 Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz Prize of the German Research Foundation and the Berlin Science Prize. Benedicte is also a member of the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities, a Knight in the French Legion of Honor, and a member of various other institutions, advisory boards, and committees. She's in New York now because she's teaching a course as a visiting professor at NYU's Institute of French Studies on spoliation, pillage, and beauty, another history of our museums. So please join me in welcoming Benedicte Savoy.
Dear Shani, dear team of the Maison Française, dear colleagues, dear Bashir, dear students from Colombia, but also from NYU, dear friends, dear all. Thank you so much, dear Shani, for your kind and generous words, and thank you for inviting me to speak in your warm and welcoming maison. At such a chilling moment in the history of our universities here in the US, obviously, but by repercussion also in Europe, in Germany, in France. Before I begin my talk, I want to say a few words about what it felt like to me, both physically and symbolically, to come to the Maison Française 10 days ago and to be here at Columbia now. I need help. Je pense. Ah non, spoil. Thank you. C'est bon. C'est bon. Being here right now means, on the one hand, facing the intimidating presence of the security apparatus, a system of barriers and control over bodies that is really unusual, even in Germany, and that also marks a broader intention, the content of critical thought. On the other hand, once I was inside, it took just a glance, maybe 3 posters on campus, to understand why American universities, and Columbia in particular, are the best in the world. And for us in Europe, like lighthouses, open to unexpected combinations of disciplines, to diverse epistemologies, and home to some of the greatest thinkers of our time, and I think especially Souleymane Bachir Diagne. Thinking back to the conversation that took place right here 10 days ago to honor Souleymane Bachir Diagne, it's difficult for me to imagine this kind, this kind of high-level and free conversations happening anywhere else, especially not on a topic like the connection between Islam and philosophy. Certainly not in Germany. It would have been impossible in Germany right now. And I'm pretty sure it would be probably not possible in a French university either. So you have these barriers here outside and this very high-level free conversation inside, and that is something very strange. It feels strange and important to have this like that. And Amy, where's Amy? Bravo pour les photos sublimes que j'ai regardé beaucoup pour faire cette page-là, précisément. To speak about museums at Columbia today means doing so not only within a university under high pressure, but also at a moment when American museums themselves are under high pressure. Everyone here, I'm sure, is aware that this March 27 order, Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History, explicitly targets museums, curatorial freedom, and the way history can be presented. So this political pressure comes at a time when museums have been put under pressure by people like me in the recent decades to be more transparent about their own truth and history. And it feels like now, like having museums being sandwiched between two kinds of very different pressure. I think this double pressure puts museums in a difficult position and raises the question of whether this is a right moment to keep a critical stance, or whether it would be better for now to show solidarity with them instead. This is maybe something we can discuss after in the Q&A. But let's begin thinking about absence in museums. We are in Venice in 1952. The refectory of the San Giorgio Maggiore Monastery has just been restored by the Cini Foundation. The black and white photo shows the elegant Palladian structure of the room. The windows are evenly spaced. The geometrical balance is emphasized by the soft distribution of light. The frontal perspective draws us in, guiding the eye to the back wall, a smooth surface framed by a frieze at the top, and wood paneling at the bottom. But within this frame, there is nothing to see but emptiness. It wasn't always like this. As many of you know, a huge painting hung here from the 16th to the 18th century, The Wedding Feast at Cana by Veronese. It remained there for over 200 years until September 1797. At that time, commissaires of the French Revolutionary Army of Napoleon Bonaparte seized the painting as war booty. It has been in the Louvre even since. As you can see in this photo from the Louvre, for a long time this painting was one that the public quite literally and mostly turned its back on, as it was placed opposite the Mona Lisa. This picture doesn't just show the absence of the painting. It reveals the presence of that absence. Since my early studies on Napoleonic looting from the perspective of the dispossessed, I've encountered the phantom pain caused by such cultural loss. Instead of healing, the wounds of cultural dispossession seem to deepen over time. That is one of the insights that has accompanied me, my professional life to these days. Since I've been living and working in Berlin, I have become accustomed to carrying out most of my works as part of a team. With my colleagues you see here, partly from my university in Berlin and partly from the University of Chang in Cameroon, over the last 3 years, we have carried out a vast survey which has culminated in the publication of this Atlas de l'Absence, le patrimoine culturel du Cameroun en Allemagne, Atlas of the Absence of Cameroonian Cultural Heritage in Cameroon and its presence in Germany. In the course of this investigation, which required a great deal of hard work psychologically, hard work because we worked a lot in military archives, we were able to reveal for the first time the overwhelming presence of 40,000 pieces of Cameroonian heritage in Germany's public museums, forming as many voids in the cultural geography of Cameroon. In my talk tonight, I'd like to look closer with you at this dialectic of presence and absence in European museums, which is not only about the presence and absence of objects, but also about words, the will, and the ability to confront this dialectic. This dialectic between presence and absence is only a small aspect of the vast, really vast, restitution debate we've been witnessing for around 5 years in Europe, which feels like a cosmos of interconnected issues like racism, mobility and borders, subject-object, the truth, facts, matrimoine, patrimoine, violence, presence and absence, toxicity of collections, etc., etc. All of them are connected, and other questions touch on matters of epistemology, history of violence, cultural and racial justice, etc. But I would like to focus on presence and absence. My presentation is divided into 4 parts, each around 10 minutes long and connected with moments from my academic journey. First, amnesia or aphasia, discretion since 1800, presence of absence, and relationality. Let's go back in time again. I will show something I show regularly, but for me, and I showed in our session yesterday, I think, at NYU. But I think it's a very important document to understand where we, the adults from today, are coming from. I'm 6 years old. It's June 1978 in Paris. Bashir, you were an adult at that time, almost. My parents have a TV. For French children in the 70s, it was a daily ritual to sit down with their parents every evening to watch the news, followed by commercials, then off to bed. I'm sure, even though I can't prove it now, that on June the 19th, 1978, at 8 p.m., I was sitting in front of the TV with my brother and our parents on the couch. On TF1, Télévision Française 1, the main national channel, the news was presented by Roger Giquel. Some of you will remember Roger Giquel, a big star. He had a new style, not just presenting the news, but also giving his personal take on it. Every night, millions of viewers tuned in to hear him. He was the voice of France. When he died in 2010, the newspaper Libération ran the headline, La France en pleurs, France is in tears. But Roger Gicquel isn't really gone. He's still alive in the archive de l'Institut National de l'Audiovisuel, merci, INA.fr. For everybody from your kitchen, you can have a look on this amazing collection of audiovisual sources. That broadcast from June 1978 is still there, and it reminds me where I come from and what really moves me today, 50 years later. Listen closely to what millions of French people, including children like my brother and me, heard that night over 40 years ago. It was about the restitution of non-European artworks to their countries of origin. A few days before, UNESCO Director General Amadou Martambo had called for this, for restitution. And Amadou Martambo was a friend of you, Suleiman. He died a few months ago in its 102nd year, and it was really moving you. C'est toi qui as dirigé les cérémonies pour son 100e anniversaire, cher Bachir et cher Mamadou, bonjour, ce qui ont été un grand événement, je pense. So let's have a... So what does this old clip from the French news tell us? First, that more than 40 years ago, the topic of restitution, something we think it's so new and some even find dangerous today, was already a hot topic publicly discussed. Secondly, in Europe, the decision to return these objects didn't seem that far off. And third, and maybe most important, there was clearly something hidden behind these words, something that wasn't easy to talk about. Listen again. Artwork that were lost under historical circumstances, probably best left undescribed. At this point, Gicquel made an odd gesture, waving his hand in the air as if brushing it off, trying to calm things down. His eyes, usually fixed on the camera, dropped for a moment. Des circonstances de l'histoire qu'il vaut mieux ne pas trop décrire. Live on TV, you could see the discomfort, almost as if he was physically uneasy about what he was saying. I was 6. My brother was 4. And today, our whole generation is in the middle of our adult lives. What could we understand from that sentence and that gesture back then? What did we make of this call to not know and not want to know? What were these historical circumstances anyway? For the adults of that time, and maybe for you, Bashir, my parents sitting next to us on the couch, my grandparents upstairs, the neighbors, our teachers, the message was clear. Gicquel was talking about the colonial period when France systematically took not only natural resources, but also a cultural object from the territories it administered. Back in 1978, that colonial history was still fresh in many people's minds and biographies in France. The Year of Africa, when 17 African colonies gained independence in 1960, was only 18 years earlier. The wars in Algeria and Indochina were still recent memories. A simple note was enough. Let's not talk about it, we know what happened. Des circonstances qu'il vaut mieux ne pas trop décrire parce qu'on les connaît tous très bien. It was less colonial amnesia than a conspiracy of silence, as one would say in Germany. I prefer to think of it as a family secret. The adults just needed a hint, they understood. For us, children, however, the phrase meant nothing. Then came the commercials, and we went to bed. A few years later, Europe entered the long era of Helmut Kohl in Germany and François Mitterrand in France. My high school didn't have a common room. When a class was cancelled, the students split into two groups. The cool ones, who drank coffee or pretended to, went to Julienne around the corner. Coffee was the cheapest thing you could order in Paris back then. The rest of us, including me, didn't like coffee yet, so we went to the Centre Pompidou, where entry was free. We spent hours exploring the bright, spacious rooms of the Musée National d'Art Moderne there, but what we loved most was being inside the artworks. We'd lose ourselves, the boundaries of our bodies, sitting in Jean Dubuffet's Jardin d'Hiver, winter garden, you can see it, a huge epoxy cave with organic white shapes and bold black lines that sparked our imagination and gave us a sense of protection, or in Joseph Beuys' Plight, a 1985 installation that created a suffocating space with man-sized felt rolls on the walls and a grand piano in the center. Immersing ourselves in these works, we stepped outside our own reality to merge with what surrounded us. Our presence within the art paradoxically allowed us to feel absent from ourselves. For some, those hours at the Centre Pompidou felt like a second birth, a symbolic birth to the world of art. For others, a journey into adolescence' metaphysical divagations. Shortly after, I dedicated my first university work, my maîtrise, to Anselm Kiefer, the painter Anselm Kiefer, the German painter Anselm Kiefer. I was no longer living with my parents. I studied German literature in Berlin, and in May 1994, Mitterrand and Kohl met for the 63rd Franco-German summit in Mulhouse in Alsace. Strangely enough, in the Automobile Museum, you can see an old car in the background here, there. On this occasion, Helmut Kohl officially returned 28 Impressionist paintings to France, including this Claude Monet, La Route de Louveciennes, which is now in the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Rouen. Most of the restituted works had been stolen in occupied Paris by a Nazi officer, likely from Jewish families during World War II, and were stored for nearly 50 years in a museum in East Germany, in East Berlin. The fall of the Berlin Wall had made the restitution possible. It was 1994. At that time, the topic of Nazis' art theft in Europe and how hundreds of artworks from Jewish families ended up in state museums wasn't openly discussed in either France or Germany. Neither Kohl nor Mitterrand mentioned the Nazis or the Jewish families in their speeches. The restitution was meant to be a symbol of Franco-German friendship. Mitterrand's speech has been preserved. It is an extraordinary source for understanding the silences from which we come, the adults from today. You can read the original speech in French here, and I have added an English translation read by an automated voice. Now we will see if it works. The idea of restitution as a super strange, l'étrangeté idea, the belief that it's better not to dwell on the provenance of the artworks in European museum and better not to tell about the occupation by the Nazis and the Holocaust. Museums described as places filled with pieces acquired under violent or questionable circumstances, and the tendency to omit all the dirty side of history and its connection to museums were all typical of the 90s in Europe. In recalling this episode, I'm not criticizing the past or accusing anyone of failures, but rather trying to understand where we, the adults of today, come from when we think about absence in our museums. Absence is more than just missing objects. We encounter gaps in memory, untold stories, and deep, deep silences surrounding our collections. When Mitterrand spoke those words, with all the authority of his office and age, he was 78. Kohl was 64. They knew their jobs. Historical transparency about the history of these paintings seemed risky to them, perhaps because it could have revealed how many European museums benefited from the persecution and destruction of European Jews before and during the war, or because it might have exposed the collaboration between certain French and German figures in the art market and museums at that time. Or maybe it would have shown the public that our beloved museums, our cultural heritage, are also archives of darkness, not just beauty. No, dear Helmut, let's not talk about it. Let's keep the lid closed and move forward. Mitterrand's speech continues. The English translation says that this example will remain very specific, while the original French uses contagion. I had contagion here in the automated voice. For Mitterrand in 1994, the restitution of paintings stolen by the Nazis from Jewish families in France felt like a disquieting disease. Disquieting because it contradicted the European narrative he and his generation had been building since the 50s, the 1950s, for good reasons. We can understand them, but building Europe was their goal, and the price was the deliberate hiding and silencing of uncomfortable historical truth, even in art, museums, and beauty. Only 4 years later, the impulse came from Washington to deep into the history of European museums in the world. It was a conference, you know, the Conference of Washington, the Washington Conference of 1998, which was the beginning of a revolution in German museums, and then really later in French museums. So American museums were faster and were at the beginning of these reconstructing of provenances. I was 6 years old when the message on state television was to avoid talking about the colonial origins of non-European artifacts in European museums we already knew. I was a young adult when François Mitterrand asked Helmut Kohl not to push the restitution of Nazi-looted art too far, confidently asserting that museums had always been filled with works obtained under conditions we don't need to dwell on. I belong to a generation of Europeans who grew up on the thin ice of these and other family secrets about museums, not just museums, by the way. There were even more difficult historical issues. Now, I ask myself, how stable are collective social structures built on such fragile foundations, on the active, even cynical exclusion of whole generations from uncomfortable historical knowledge? I had always loved museums. I knew what I owed them, ce que je leur devais, and why I loved them. I was European through and through, and maybe that's why I wanted to know. I became a museum historian. Discretion since 1800. As many of you know, between 1794 and 1811, revolutionary France, followed by Napoleonic France, confiscated thousands of works of art, manuscripts, precious books, and even state archives from European countries occupied by its armies. On this drawing by Benjamin Six, you see the removal, l'enlèvement of the gallery in Kassel. It's your gallery. We have an expert on this question here. As this act of looting was euphemistically called enlèvement at the time, in 1807, by Dominique Vivant-Denon, who was at that time the director of the Louvre / Musée Napoléon. Examining paintings for the Louvre. This aggressive policy of appropriation was justified by a bold, if not twisted, doctrine claiming that works of art and science, as products of the genius of freedom, should be liberated from the enemies of freedom and brought back to the motherland of liberty, France, of course. Officially, these objects, another one from Kassel, here, oh, it's a zoom. Officially, these objects were meant to promote public education and advance the arts. However, this accumulation of intellectual and artistic capital also represented an accumulation of symbolic power and real financial capital. In 1810, the French Ministry of Finance, represented by the young Henri Bell, later known as the writer Stendhal, here on the right, urged Louvre director Denon, shown here on the left, to finally start cataloging the museum's vast collection. The goal was to create a comprehensive record of all the works of art confiscated since the French Revolution, both from France and abroad, and now held at the Musée Napoléon / Louvre. There is a letter in the Louvre archives from October 1810. In this letter, Bell wrote to Denon, « Monsieur, je suis passé chez vous pour vous soumettre le modèle ci-joint de procès-verbal. Nous pouvons décrire en une ligne un tableau quelconque, si beau et si pittoresque qu'il soit. Même la transfiguration. Notre travail n'aura pas la beauté pittoresque, mais il aura la beauté administrative, la clarté et la brièveté. » At that time, even a temple of beauty like the Louvre had to adhere to the bureaucratic and statistic logic of the Napoleonic state. Art and aesthetics had to be framed within a cold administrative system. For the government, the purpose was quite concrete. They needed to understand the financial capital tied to this accumulation of artistic capital. The attached draft of the inventory sent by de Belle was an empty table, 9 columns printed on large, heavy paper serving as a template. Each page began with a column for the item number, followed by columns for the artist's name, a description of the subject, dimensions, origin, provenance, origin, estimated value of the work, estimated value of the frame or pedestal, current location, and on the far right, remarks. None of the columns were wider than 7 centimeters, and since the titles and vertical lines separating the columns were pre-printed, there was no room for art historical divagation or deviation. That is administrative beauty. This was the birth of the modern museum database or spreadsheet. There was a debate over the origin column. The museum director suggested using provenance, but the finance department insisted on origin. A look on the completed pages of the Catalogue Général du Musée Napoléon shows that origin wasn't used in an art historical sense, like assigning works to geographical schools, but as a political term. Entries like Conquête 1806, Conquest 1806, or Conquête 1809 referred to the trophy status of the objects after they were taken by France, acting as a kind of pedigree. This detailed inventory was intended only for internal museum use and government administration, not for the public. In fact, during the Napoleonic era, the museum was very secretive about the origins of the works. That's why many foreign visitors at that time complained about the lack. Oh, we have the Noces de Cana, Couvent des Bénédictins de Saint-Georges Majeur à Venise. But it was only for him and his colleagues, this kind of information. Visitors were upset. For example, Ludwig Völkel, a museum director from Kassel, this city largely stripped of its collections by Denon in 1807, praised the Louvre for its academic value, but criticized the absence of provenance details. Manches unbekannte oder nicht genug gewürdigte Kunstwerk erlangte dem ihm gebührenden Ruhm, wenn auch der Ort, woher es genommen war, fast immer verschwiegen oder nicht genau angegeben wurde. We sent the museum director, he was a museum director, regretting that the attention of Parisians had not been directed towards the treasures of Kassel, the beautiful city. However, on the French side, these omissions were significant in order to avoid provoking restitution requests. At that time, the European intelligentsia, including big stars like Goethe, the brothers Grimm, Antonio Canova, Helmina von Chessy, Quatremer de Quincy, but also Russian and British intellectuals, shared their views on how France's aggressive centralization of European heritage in Paris was transforming cultural geography. They discussed the massive presence of artworks in Paris, the absence left in dispossessed cities, and the future of the arts in Europe. When Napoleon was exiled for the second time in 1815, the question of returning the European artworks gathered in Paris sparked heated debates across Europe, including in Russia. And now I'm not sure if... Yes. The texts from this period formed the first transnational corpus of work on restitution. They are really helpful for understanding today's debates on cultural justice and the restitution of colonial collections. Many were published in Paris in the 1990s, after the bicentenaire de la Révolution française. And And among the hundreds of pages on restitution from 1815, one document stands out for linking France's imperial Napoleonic logic with today's post-colonial discussions. It's a famous letter by Viscount Castlereagh, the British Foreign Secretary, who helped manage the coalition that defeated Napoleon, advocating for restitutions. In this letter, Castlereagh highlights the link between museum collections, imperial fantasies, and the post-imperial trauma of becoming a small country again. He writes, "These spoils impede a moral reconciliation between France and the countries it has invaded. But whilst these objects remain at Paris, constituting, as it were, the title deeds of the countries which have been given up, the sentiments of reuniting these countries again to France will never be altogether extinct, nor will the genius of the French people ever completely associate itself with the more limited existence assigned to the nation under the Bourbons." For me, this sentence is key. It shows how, even today, collections from former colonies in Europe not only fuel colonial nostalgia or neo-colonial arrogance in the countries that hold them, but also keep dispossessed countries dependent on the former powers that control their cultural heritage. I would like to show you two short film excerpts to illustrate the perspective of the dispossessed in the 20th century. The first is You Hide Me from 1971, shot in the basement of the British Museum in London by the great Ghanaian filmmaker Nii Kwate Owu, a film I rediscovered during my research for the book Africa's Struggle for Its Art, and that has since been integrated into, for example, into Isaac Julian's impressive installation, once again from 2022. You can see it here. Instead of a film clip, because the film is protected, I'm going to play you a short excerpt from the soundtrack performed by Nii Kwate Owu, the director himself. This passage needs little commentary. Already in 1971, Owu described the almost exclusive presence of African heritage in Western museums as a dispossession of the ability to form an image of oneself, with that image shaped externally and reflected back like a distorted mirror to the regions of origin. Another recent example, and we will Colombia is so lucky to have Mati Diop tomorrow, after tomorrow on Thursday, I think. Another recent example is Dahomey by Mati Diop. In her new film, Mati Diop, who won the Golden Bear at the Berlin Film Festival last year, features students discussing the return of royal treasures that were violently looted by French colonial troops in 1892 to the Republic of Benin in West Africa. One of these students describes heritage dispossession as a hostage-taking of memory, which becomes filled only with external references. The passage speaks for itself. The issue of the presence and absence of works looted during the colonial era goes far beyond the mere physical movement of objects from A to B on from B to A. From the perspective of the student, it is deeply connected to questions of memory, self-construction, and even the writing of one's own history and narratives. On Thursday, here, not here, it's not here. No, it's at the Landfest with Mati Diop for the Q&A session. I warmly recommend you to come if you haven't seen it already. Third, presence of absence. This is a fulgurite. A fulgurite, from the Latin fulgur, meaning lightning, is a rare mineral formation created when lightning strikes sand and lose sediment. The intense heat from the lightning creates these unique formations which capture the path of the electric discharge. On November 28, 2017, I felt like I had been turned into a fulgurite while crossing a street in my Berlin neighborhood. We all know those moments when a major event becomes so tied to where and when you first hear about it that you remember it for decades. For me, it's something like Michael Jackson's death in 2009. Hearing the news while going through airport security in Lyon after a conference. This time, the fulgurite situation was because of a speech by French President Emmanuel Macron in Ouagadougou. I don't know how to put Emmanuel Macron not so loud. Maybe you should protect your ears in one moment. In Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. In that famous speech, we will have it in 1 second, Macron, hoping to improve France's damaged image in West Africa, announced that he wanted to return part of Africa's heritage that is kept in French museums. Achtung. I never thought that in my lifetime, a French president would speak so directly and openly, even using the dangerous term restitution. This was particularly striking given that just a few months earlier, France had harshly refused a request from the president of Benin to return the treasures from the kingdom of Dahomey in present-day Benin. In 2016, the French government's response was « Les biens que vous évoquez ont été intégrés de longue date, parfois depuis plus d'un siècle, au domaine public mobilier de l'État français. Conformément à la législation en vigueur, ils sont soumis aux principes d'inaliénabilité, d'imprescriptibilité et d'insaisissabilité. En conséquence, leur restitution n'est pas possible. Under current law, these cultural assets are subject to the principles of inalienability, timelessness, and immunity from seizure. Therefore, restitution is not possible. What followed not only changed my real and intellectual life, but also marked the beginning of a major global shift in how we discuss restitution, cultural heritage, and the presence and absence of this heritage depending on whether you live in the Western world or in the Africa, for example. It also brought attention to issues of cultural justice connected to racial justice, reparations, and repair. Together with my friend and colleague, Professor Felwine Sarr, whom you can see here on the left, and in the middle you have the French Minister of Culture at that time, Franck Riester, I was asked by Emmanuel Macron to write this report on the promised restitutions. We both accepted this mission impossible mission, putting our other work on hold for months. We felt the time was right to apply our knowledge and experience to make real change. From March to October 2018, we visited French and international institutions and traveled to 4 French-speaking African countries, former colonies. We paid for the trips ourselves to stay independent from French authorities. We went into these conversations and archival work with an open mind, using the methods we developed over nearly 20 years, myself studying the history of museums in Europe, and Felwine Sarr studying the future of, or designing the future, or dreaming the future of Africa and the connection between the two. For eight months, we navigated through various spaces, real, symbolic, and imagined, as well as different times. We examined the past, tracing the provenance of African collections in Parisian archives and revisiting forgotten restitution demands from over 50 years ago. Here you can see some of the most important African voices advocating for restitution after independence, such as the archaeologist Egbo Eyo from Nigeria, and Amadou Matambo here, and others. We engage with the present, having intense conversations with museum professionals, politicians, artists, and activists on both continents, and visiting African museums like the brand new Musée Royal de Fumban, in Cameroon, the most impressive museum I've ever seen, shaped like a giant spider wrapped by 2 massive snakes. The entry to the museum, and that's the exit. We also focused on the future, working with lawyers to draft a legal framework for the restitutions and discussing with African colleagues, and Souleymane Bachir Diagne in Nantes at that time was really, really important for this, for being radical. You helped us to become really radical, more radical than we were at the very beginning, and discussing, with object, etc. One of the most profound experiences for me was a physical one, feeling the absence of African objects in their original locations and then seeing them a few hours later after a night flight in French museums. The first one was the empty palace of Abomey in Benin, and the next day we saw the objects or statues taken from there by the French army in 1892, which were then displayed at the Musée du Quai Branly and have now been returned to Benin. That physical experience of seeing objects in European museums and their absence in their places of origin was so powerful that ever since I've kept repeating it. I'll show you two examples of the physical experience of presence and absence in cultural heritage. First, the bust of Nefertiti, which is in its Berlin Museum today, and how it's displayed at its original site in Tel El Amarna, near El Minya in Egypt, where I visited in November 2022. There, you'll find a poor quality replica of Nefertiti high up in a glass case, while a guide explains approximatively that it has been in Germany for decades. This gesture is connected with Almanya, means it's gone to Germany. I think the children, this generation, doesn't understand a lot about the situation like me in the 70s. Another example from Berlin is a Pergamon altar or altar of Zeus in English, which has been in Berlin since the 1870s. It originally stood on the Acropolis of Bergama in modern-day Turkey, where a small museum is now dedicated to it. You can see the Acropolis there. It was in October 23 when Turkey became 100 years old. That's the reason why you have so much flags here, because normally they have not a lot of national, in Bergama, not such demonstration of the nation. In Bergama, you have a small museum with this. In both cases, poor replicas, models, or old photographs spark interest, but also create unsatisfied curiosity and confusion because the connection to the originals is so abstract for those who may never have the chance to see the originals in Berlin, especially due to Europe's restrictive visa policies. Because issues of cultural justice are inseparable from questions of mobility and borders, as well as the racism associated with them. From these repeated physical experience of the presence of absence, I gained two insights. First, too many museums in Europe today, especially the wealthy museums in Berlin, that I know well, instead of functioning as places of connection and relationality, considering their vast collections and the city's cosmopolitan population, remain sites of separation, control over interpretation, retention of knowledge and objects, and mortifying intellectual hierarchies. Secondly, transforming this physical experience of presence and absence into an academic method became urgent and crucial to me. Relationality. The Atlas of Absence, I mentioned at the beginning, was born from this sense of urgency. Published a year ago or two, yes, it's still a key focus for my colleagues. We worked on this project between my university in Berlin and the University of Chang under Professor Guafo in the Grassfields region of Cameroon. Our investigation began with this hypothesis. That's Chang, and that's my university in Berlin. Our hypothesis was, in present-day Germany, there is a phantom Cameroon, a term inspired by Michel Léry's well-known anti-colonial book, L'Afrique fantôme. Over 40,000 objects from Cameroon are currently held in German public museums, making it the largest collection of its kind in the world. However, since the German colonial period, which lasted 34 years, from the Berlin Conference to the end of World War I, these objects have mostly been stored away, unpublished, and unknown. The little that is on display is presented in a disturbing way, as I will explain further. At the same time, in Cameroon, the memory of these objects has, in part, faded. Yet, in some cases, it has been carefully preserved and passed down through generations. For this collective project, we traced for the first time the invisible, or in some cases, traumatizing presence of Cameroon in German museums. At the same time, we explored the forms and consequences of the absence of cultural heritage within several regions of Cameroon itself. The collaborative work felt like an unexpected expedition into the deep layers of European knowledge systems and unquestioned certainties into terminologies and paradigms. It was truly unsettling, difficult, and exhausting work. We spent several months in Germany sifting through disturbing and violent colonial military reports, as well as museum records full of errors, inconsistencies, racist terminology, and explicit references to violence. For example, here we see an archive entry for a drum, today located at the Rautenstrauch-Jost Museum in Cologne, and attributed to the Cameroonian Bakoko people. It states, sehr große Trommel, really big drum, schwer zu haben, hard to obtain, nur mit Gewalt zu erlangen, only obtainable through violence. We repeatedly visited the pesticide-contaminated storage rooms of ethnological museums and used ice training spreadsheets to track down the over 40,000 inventory numbers of objects from all regions of Cameroon that survived the destruction of World War II in Germany, as a considerable number had been destroyed. One of the most re-traumatizing experiences for our colleagues was visiting the Cameroon Room at the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, a new reconstruction of the Baroque palace of the Prussian kings, which The Guardian once described as an imposing Disneyland castle minus the fun. The facade appears Baroque, but inside, the Humboldt Forum feels like an airport. We are sent into Africa and right after the escalator arrive at Cameroon. The room is filled with door frames and architectural elements from royal palaces taken by German colonial troops around 1900 after the palaces and villages were burned down. An oversized photo on the wall reminds visitors of these violent events. The room feels like a memorial to the burnt villages. Due to public pressure in recent years, the museum has placed provenance information at ankle height. Visitors have to bend down to read about the horrific circumstances that led to these magnificent palace elements being displayed in Berlin. But when you do, as one visitor noted on YouTube, this happens. It's like an installation of a contemporary art, but unwillingly. If you bend to read the labels, you will have this siren. So, alarme. Alarme means in French, aux armes. So you have to go to weapons. And it's exactly the situation. So it's something like if you need to know the truth, you will have problems. If this display is hard for us European visitors to bear, it's easy to understand that for people of Cameroonian origin, who often have a direct connection to or even come from the villages once burned by the Germans, but now rebuilt, like Baham or Banjul, whose royal palace you see here. So here are the rests of Banjul and Baham, and that's Baham. That's Banjul, in the west of Cameroon. For them, it's even more challenging. In fact, the museum makes no connection to present-day Cameroon, the Humboldt Forum. It presents a lifeless world which undermines the works themselves, crushing them under the weight of history and preventing them from telling any story other than the violence they endured. It also reduces visitors from Africa or Afro-Germans to mere scenes of physical violence and humiliation once again. On the other side, in Cameroon, we met with scholars, museum professionals, activists, artists, and several traditional kings and their entourage. We understood that no one here was willing to be victimized, instrumentalized, or give up their agency because of these German museum politics. This includes my dear colleague, Dr. Richard Tsogang-Fossi, seen here, and PhD candidate Irene Machinda, here, in one of the courts of the Palace of Batoufam, who have, yes, and these two colleagues are now friends, and I'm grateful for everything I have learned thanks to them. For example, in recent years, I've learned to speak much less and to listen much more in this context. And that is why, in conclusion to my talk, I would like to give the floor to one of our young and brilliant colleagues, Foga MC Cornelius Rifem, a PhD candidate in Potsdam, near Berlin, and a member of the Ntso people of Cameroon, whose royal heritage has been in Berlin and Stuttgart for over 100 years. Foga belongs to a generation in Germany that doesn't hesitate with great politeness to make it clear when it's better for you, in this case for me, to stop talking. Reflecting on the endless discussions we had during our work on the Atlas of Absence, when we began to question the term object, which seems too passive to describe things that, from a Cameroonian perspective, possess unique powers, personalities, and even agency, Foga subtly criticized the substitute terms we had considered, fully aware of the epistemological limits we were facing, such as subject or entity instead of objects. His elegant critique lasts just 1 minute. For me, it's one of the most beautiful things I've heard in recent years. It makes clear that there's a still significant epistemological task ahead of us, to integrate categories of knowledge and meaning that museums, in their obsession with separation and categorization, are currently unable to accommodate. And above all, it confirms that the time has come to be silent and to listen. Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. That was real. The particular last part was really moving and but also terrifying. I'm from Berlin, so there is some context. So I wanted to ask you, with this important work that you're doing there now, how you see the chances of things actually moving in Germany a little bit too, be it on Nefertiti, be it on those collections that you gathered the report on now, or in anything else. I mean, in France, we saw a little bit of things happening following the 2017 report, but also obviously, what was it, 29 objects out of all, yeah, as the film Daume is describing. What is the situation in Germany as you would see it right now?
I think it's a difficult question right now because Germany, France, and Europe is going into an economy of war. So all the projects about museums, work like that, decolonizing, archives, etc., are under threat, like here, but for different reasons, because they have to spare money now. And a lot of these kind of projects, I think, won't continue now. But we can say that in Germany, in the last 10 years, they did a lot of work, and that's the reason why at the very beginning I was a little bit uncomfortable with criticizing museums, because I think it's really important right now, because you asked right now, to acknowledge this movement, this progression or improving transparency a little bit, in a time where now we will have something like a backlash and some people or governments trying to put back all this transparency and to return to the 70s and 90s when we said, oh, it's not so important to know about the history of these museums. So I think for me now, I have no answer, but I'm thinking a lot about being more solidarly to museums for now. and to remember that criticizing museums is not because we don't love them, but it's because we love them, that we want them to be more in our times and not trying to hide their history, for example, our history.
What do you think about the fact that for instance, my children, Gen Z and millennials, they refuse to go to the Musée du Quai Branly anymore, and they kind of boycott this kind of museums and this kind of exhibition. So what do you think about the position that French museums should take regarding these collections? Because, as you said, I don't think the restitutions will come in a near future. So what do you think we should do also as a kind of user or viewer of the arts?
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that boycott is a good idea. I'm really pushing to knowledge. So you have to know, to see the situation, to analyze the situation, even to go to archive if it's possible. And I have the very comfortable situation of being an academic and not having the responsibility for museums. So it's easy to advise something, but I think it's difficult to be within a museum, because museums are highly hierarchical institutions, and you have a lot of different generations trying to move something and other not to move the things. So I have no advice, but concrete. But I'm sure that the historical transparency is the most important thing in every institution. And if you are German like me or hybrid, you know that to be a strong society, you need this historical transparency. You need to work on history, to aufarbeiten in German. So it's not only to work on history, but it's to, how do you say, kneten? Need history, and every generation has to do that. I think in this case, because of decades of intransparency, of silence, etc., we did some of the job, but I think the new generation have to go and to do the same. But it won't be easy now because of these other powers. So museums are in sandwich positions, and I'm not sure what to do. But it's important to repeat and repeat that criticism is because of love and not because of our kind of criticism. It's because of love and not because of hatred. And it's another kind of pressure. Thank
you. I'm wondering if the works are sent back to the countries they came from, how would the places that they originally came from display the work when the culture has quite evolved from when the works were integral to the community? So is it going to be another museum with also the estrangement that museums confer on objects, or how, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I think it's also a part of an answer to you. First of all, it's really important to remember that even if European Museum would give back, let's say, 1,000 objects from the Quai Branly, it's a lot, 1,000. They gave back 26 to Benin. So 1,000 would be a lot, but the Musée du Quai Branly has 69,000 from Africa, from Sub-Saharan Africa. So if you give 1,000 back, you will still have 68,000 in Paris, and it's exactly the same for Berlin, 75,000. If you give back 1,000, you have still 74,000, etc. So one of the very important things to do in museums in Europe is to think about the display of all the objects which will remain in Europe, because nobody in Africa now is claiming for the restitution of ten thousands of objects. They want to have some objects who are very historically, symbolically, philosophically important, but not masses of objects. So for European museums, it's really important to think about this kind of display at Humboldt Forum. It is the right display for the next decades, for our children, I'm not sure, because it's like a Mahnmal in German. How do you say Mahnmal? It's a negative monument, a monument about violence. And you can't connect to the beauty or to the function of these works. You can only connect to the brutality of German rulers at the beginning, in the generation before the Nazis. So it's not a good idea to keep it like that. And to answer your question, I think I have no answer, but because we have only one case for now, of a real physical restitution of an important sum of objects, these 2.5 tons to present-day Benin. And Benin is like an observatory of what to do with when the objects came back. We have one format, one example, and in Benin it's a remusealization of the objects and trying to make them national. They are from Abomey, which is only one place in the Republic of Benin, and the president tried to make them national, speaking a lot about they were from Abomey, but now they are from the Republic, they are a Republican good. So a little bit like in French. That's one way, but you have a lot of different ways to do. In Cameroon, for instance, where the central government is not really implicated in the negotiations, the kings, les chefferies in Cameroon have a lot of ideas how to reactivate their heritage. You see the Museum of Humban, which is a museum, a different museum. It's not like the Louvre, but it has a really interesting setting and way to present things. So, and it's really important to have this discussion, not here, but there. And our colleagues, I think, I'm sure, in les Ateliers de la Pensée in Dakar, but also in Cameroon, in Yaoundé, in Douala, etc. There is a group of people thinking about the future of display, the future, the reactivation, and this very important concept of intertemporality, because it is a time between the moment they were taken and the moment when they come back. And you're right, the people are different, the boundaries are different, the religions can be different, but there's still a connection, and this connection has to be figured out. And it's one of the reasons why it's interesting to work on these topics, because we have no answer right now. Normally in Europe, you will always do things having an answer in Germany. If I gave something back, I want to know exactly what will happen. And the nice things about restitution is you don't know, it's open. And this openness is an epistemological shift, if you want, because, or a political one. You have to bear not being able to control the future in this case. So I think it's interesting.
Okay, we have one more question here.
Well, I actually have two questions, but here.
Sorry.
So I'll just quickly ask both, but please answer only one. One would be, I think what you said about transparency is so important, and a lot of museums have done a lot of work about restitution, provenance, and explained the provenance very carefully, not at ankle height, but at better height. I'm wondering how much work that's actually doing, and what the limits of that are, because I think they all feel pretty good about doing that, and it's great, and it's really important. But what
it takes time.
It takes a lot of time and a lot of work, and it's also pedagogically really important. But then it's still there; it hasn't gone back. And then my second question is, what's an example of relationality? Which it's so beautiful the way your colleague explained it. that actually has already happened, or that you could envision? Maybe you just want to say one of those.
Thank you. About relationality, I would say the example in Benin, and you will see it in the film of Mati Diop, is not about relationality. It doesn't work like that. But if you are in Fumban, the object there, they can go on loan for rituals and come back to museums. So you have formats, and in Mali, in Bamako, we heard Felwine and myself from Salia Malé, who was the director at that time. He explained us that it's like a library. You can borrow objects and bring every 5 years if you need them, and you can bring them back. So it's maybe one model of relationality. And what beyond provenances? Yes, I agree, provenances are comfortable now. It was not the case 10 years ago, but now it's comfortable to explain how the objects came. And for me, this restitution of knowledge, I'm not really into restitutions, material restitutions. The problem is if you don't use this very dangerous word and this threat of, wow, we will restitute, etc., the museums are not interested in provenances. So you have to menacer with restitution in order to put them in movement, I think. And so it's a strategical point. So I will keep on speaking on restitution, and you have to restitute, etc., because without this pressure in Germany, they will go asleep again. So they will not proceed. So, but it's comfortable now. And as I said, for me, not the physical restitution is the most important thing. It's important, but the restitution of knowledge, of explaining to our young generation, not only here, but also in the countries of origin, it's important because if you have the knowledge, if you go to the Humboldt Forum and you have the knowledge about all these horrific burning of villages, mass rape of women, in the same moment when they take the object, they take the woman, etc., and you have it as a fact, and the public would know these kind of facts, then I'm sure we will have a collective step into a solution. What to do with these objects? Do we want to have them in the middle of Berlin, etc.? But we have a lot to do and to explain and to go into the society, not only putting that on display, but explaining and restituting knowledge on several levels. We do it in Berlin on football weekends, when the African community are meeting for football matches in Berlin. We have a stand with Cameroonian heritage, Atlas of Abwesenheit, and huge posters, and the people are doing Instagram selfies for our posters. So it's a kind of restitution of knowledge.
Thank you very much.